Asia's World City. This is the brand that the Hong Kong government has been trying to build for the city since 2001. Yet in the same city that's branded as Asia's World City, we see headlines such as this. In fact, Hong Kong's legislation is far behind Asia's standards for LGBT rights, let alone the world standards. But despite this, Hong Kong's public support for the LGBT community seems rather strong according to multiple surveys and studies. In fact, Hong Kong ranks as one of the top spots in Asia for the LGBT community. So what's the deal here? First and foremost, I think it's important that we understand Hong Kong's history when it comes to LGBT rights. Apart from the Bill of Rights from 1991 and the Equal Opportunities Commission, there is very little in the way of anti-discrimination policies towards the LGBT community. And if you really take a look at the Bill of Rights, you'll find it's a very weak policy. And both the Bill of Rights and the Equal Opportunities Commission only apply to the public sector of Hong Kong.
In terms of legal rights, like anti-discrimination legislation, it was already mentioned and proposed before 1997. It's just that the bill never got passed. It was proposed as a part of the anti-discrimination bills. So it included legislation like racial discrimination ordinance, sex discrimination ordinance. It was a part of that package, but the LGBT element was left out. And because of the political structure of the Legislative Council, it was almost impossible to get any legislation passed regarding LGBT rights.
And if it wasn't bad enough with the poor anti-discrimination policies, the LGBT community has to face countless other legal challenges, from marriage to spousal benefits to adoption and taxation. However, despite these huge gaps and notable shortcomings in legislation when compared to Israel and Taiwan, arguably the two most advanced countries in LGBT rights within the Asian continent, Hong Kong seems to be doing rather well in terms of public opinion.
Yes, absolutely. I think in general, people in Hong Kong are more accepting of LGBT people. The latest survey was published by CUHK back in January. What we have seen is across the board on various LGBT issues, people are more accepting.
The results shown actually correlates to that done overseas in Western countries.
When it comes to anti-discrimination law for LGBT people, you see the level of support, it was like, I would say close to 60 or 60 something percent.
And you can see the trend is growing, and the majority of the people in Hong Kong are in support of LGBT rights in general.
I remember there was also questions about asking people what would they think if a company sponsors an LGBT event, say Pride Parade, and I think people didn't have any problem with it.
I've been to Pride twice. Once I really got into it, it was definitely some of the happiest moments I've had in Hong Kong. It's an incredible feeling being surrounded by hundreds and hundreds of people that even though you know nothing about them, you know for a fact that they would drop everything and fight for you. I think that this kind of like little gay suffering you go through, the things you go through in your childhood as a gay teenager, everyone LGBT has probably been through that, and it's really comforting to know that there are so many people who have that shared experience.
Honestly, I feel like it was one of the best experiences that a younger me could have had in order to feel affirmed in my own identity. Because when I was in that kind of situation, I was still grappling with my own identity, my own sexual identity, whether or not I should come out. And when I did go to that Pride Parade, it helped me understand that I was someone who could be accepted by a community. I was someone who was worthy of being recognized for who I am. And that was something that really helped me out in understanding who I was.
Just, seeing a lot of queer people in one space being really happy, there's something really powerful about that. And I think that's what's most feared about the gay movement in general. I think there's so much power in that.
And it's always been a really amazing experience. You meet so many people who are just so proud, so comfortable with who they are, and I think it's really inspiring to see.
The tragedy is that once the event ends, people put their flags back in their bags, they peel off their stickers, wash off their face paint, and have to hide themselves again for the rest of the year.
Obviously, throughout Asia, we are not the best, but we are not the worst either. I would say we are middle of the pack. Over the years, I would say it's a very significant increase in awareness of LGBT issues in society. Legally speaking, of course, in Hong Kong, we don't have an anti-discrimination law. Hong Kong does not recognize marriage equality or same-sex marriage, which we are working on it. So, I mean, yes, we've made some progress, but it's still a long journey when it comes to full equality. Overall speaking, I think the level of acceptance, it's on the good side.
But it's not, unfortunately, it's not reflected in our policies due to various reasons.
So if we have public support, what reasons can the government have for not advancing the city's legislature?
I think it's culture and tradition. It's something new to them. It's something they don't know how to deal with. It's something they don't know how to respond with. It's something they don't know how to agree with. Culture is a man and a woman together. They're gonna have a family, they're gonna have a child. It's Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve. That's what they believe in.
Most Asian families, have beliefs like children must, parents would expect their children to have children themselves, which already is kind of like, you can't be gay, otherwise you won't be able to have children. And they'll think it's morally wrong if you marry someone of the same gender, like things like that, old traditions.
They stick to culture. Western people are they're more individual. They have individual values, and in Asian cultures, they don't have that. The Asian culture in general, they're more of family instead of individual.
It would appear that a fundamental difference in values is the leading factor.
I think definitely a lack of exposure. I think that it's not talked about as much as it is in a lot more Western countries. It really kind of hinders the perception of it. It's not very progressive.
Hong Kong's power distance can also be attributed to the problem. With a score of 68 on the Power Distance Index, Hong Kong society largely believes that inequality between people is acceptable.
It's a matter of the philosophy in those regions. In the East, we put collectivism before individuality, but in the West, individuality is key to the functioning of a society. The maximum aggregate happiness for an individual is what is good for society there. So if individuals speak out, cry out, and form, ironically, a collective, the government will listen. However, in the East, people are taught to be part of the collective and not to progress it. And that is an unfortunate piece of thinking.
But if you take a closer look at all of these reasons, there's an underlying excuse of Hong Kong's community isn't ready for LGBT rights. However, this makes little to no sense, as the studies and surveys we mentioned earlier have proved that there is public support for LGBT rights in Hong Kong.
The fact of the matter is the government is not interested. They've been saying it's a very controversial issue. Hong Kong maybe is not ready, and obviously we have some lawmakers who are opposing to marriage equality. But what we are telling them is, look, if you look at different surveys done by both CUHK and HKU, you know where the trend is going.
A lack of translation of social sentiment into actual legislation, because you'll find in Hong Kong, I think about 60-something% of people are in favor of enacting anti-discrimination bills for LGBT people. So I think it's more of a governmental structure issue rather than a sentiment issue.
In short, colonialism. There's a lot of evidence of progressive queer life in various different Asian countries prior to colonialism. Like in India, It was very much a part of society, and there's still villages of just transgender people living together to this day. In Japanese culture, samurai culture, gay was normal. It was primarily what they did, really.
Pre-communist Asian philosophy, there was this thing called 知亲, which means knowing your heart's soulmate, knowing your soulmate. And that was created out of the love of two men, a musician and his closest confidant. I can't remember their names, but that's a story that I remember being told by my grandmother. And basically communism came in with their ideals and said, no, that's not a thing. And I think that's permeated it's permeated the membrane of time, and Hong Kong is now being affected by this now more than ever, obviously. And obviously westernized ideals, although coming around, are still very conservative and restrictive.
Because of years of being told that speaking out is wrong, anyone else who's bold and puts themselves outside of the crowd is therefore wrong, regardless for whatever reason they're doing it. So especially queer people get targeted for that because they stand out of the crowd by proxy.
It is also arguable that Taiwan's Chinese background put it in a similar position to Hong Kong, yet they were successful in advancing LGBT rights.
Taiwan, they already achieved marriage equality, so it's a milestone, not just for them, but they're like a beacon of LGBT equalities. Well, not just LGBT equalities, actually, maybe human rights in Asia. If you look at Taiwan, and the government actually takes initiative to implement these changes, and for Hong Kong, it's quite difficult for them to do that because because they're not chosen by people in Hong Kong. I think that's one of the main reasons.
I think Hong Kong can take some notes, girl, because Taiwan and Hong Kong are both Asian, it's Chinese. So if they can do it, why can't we? The Taiwanese government has struck a balance, I want to say. They have listened to the LGBTQIA+ community over there. So I think the Hong Kong government should do the same because, hello, there's no excuse. So, you know what I mean? Yeah, it's gonna be unfair. It's gonna be unfair if I compared Hong Kong to Western countries, but now you don't have an excuse because our neighbor, Miss Taiwan over there, she legalized same-sex marriage, so you should too.
Taiwan is probably a really good comparison. It's also in a similar situation politically as well as culturally, and I think that it's really inspiring to see a country that is generally more socially conservative taking such great big strides in favor of same-sex marriage as well as LGBT rights in general. I think that's a good place for Hong Kong to take inspiration from.
We are asking that there has to be a legislation to protect LGBT individuals from discrimination. We have been asking that for over 20 years, and we are still asking. And of course, we are saying that Hong Kong is ready for marriage equality. Almost throughout the world, we have close to 30 countries or territories that recognize same-sex marriage. The sky obviously hasn't fallen in those places. So if Hong Kong is ready, Hong Kong is ready for it to begin with, and if Hong Kong does it, life will go on as usual. It doesn't mean that sky will come crashing down. So, but we need to have a dialogue. We need to have a very clear pathway as how we can do this. This is the best way for Hong Kong, and Taiwan has done it. I know Thailand. The Thai government has said that they wanted to legislate for civil union, so there's no reason why Hong Kong is lagging behind.
So Hong Kong wants to be Asia's world city, and its people are seemingly ready to take a step towards this. However, it would appear that the biggest hindrance to Hong Kong claiming this title is its own government. So to most people, the solution here is as clear as night and day. It's only a matter of whether the people in power to make a change can see it too. So once again, huge thank you to everyone who made this episode possible, from the expert guests to the student guests, Mansie Tang and Rain Brontenell, and so many others. All the information is down below in the description.